So one of the first things that I think to myself that I want to do here is I want to go with kind of a high key style image because I love how clean everything looks when it's bright. But I also want to keep some color separation between the seal and its surroundings. I purposely cropped out all of the water and rocks. That way we could get this nice clean background. The benefit of doing that is that we're going to have a very cold background and foreground, and then a very warm, main subject, which is going to draw the eye, right? So first thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to do this inside of Photoshop, I'm going to start off with that kind of high key look, get things nice and bright, make sure that I'm not clipping any of my highlights. If I was to clip, I've got my highlight alert turned on here. You see, I'm not going close to white because I want there to be a little bit of color left there and things just get too bright. So somewhere in here is going to be my starting point. I'm going to recover highlights, lift shadows a touch, maybe bring down the exposure just a bit. Now, I'm going to process this twice. This is a very common thing that I do, where I'm going to process it once for background and once for our subject here. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the colder color temperature that I want for the surroundings. That way it takes on that nice blue cast, something like this. It's probably too cold for our seal. You see that we start to lose some of the warmth, but we're going to warm him back up. So I'm not worried about what it's doing to him. I'm also going to go down to the camera calibration tab and add just a touch of saturation, something like this. I don't want things to get too nuclear blue, but I want there to be some nice color there. And the other thing that I do to every raw file before I open it up inside of Photoshop is I go up to my detail tab and I decrease the radius, so it's a small fine grain sharpening, and I increase the detail slider, which makes it a deconvolution type sharpening. Basically just trying harder to find details. And then the other thing that I do here is I hold down Alt or Option and I click on this masking slider and I mask it out to where it's no longer sharpening noise. So we want to be sharpening water drops, details in the snow, and our seal, and not make the noise any worse than it is. Speaking of noise, I want to zoom in and make sure that we're starting with a fairly clean file. I'm pretty sure my ISO is fairly low, 500. Yeah, I'm not too worried about noise here. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to open it up as a smart object inside of Photoshop. So I'm just going to I'm going to right click, go to Edit In, and then open as a smart object in Photoshop. This is going to give us the ability to re-access that raw file so we can change our color temperature for our Weddell seal. So now we are open inside of Photoshop. You can tell that it's a smart object because it's got this little tiny icon here. Now what I can do is I can right click on the title, go down to New Smart Object via Copy, and now we're going to have two versions of our raw file open here. One is going to be for our seal, one is going to be for our background. So I'm going to double click on this top one, which will be for our seal, and we're going to open this back up, and now I'm going to reprocess it with our seal in mind. So I'm going to probably maybe bring down the exposure just a touch. Let's lift our shadows and recover our highlights a bit more so we gain detail and texture here. And then I'm going to go to my white balance and I'm going to find a white balance that works really well for our seal. I really want there to be some warm tones that keep it natural to how they naturally are, and it's going to contrast really nice against that background. So I feel like this is probably a good color temperature for our seal, and you see how different it is. We went from, 5400, something like that, all the way up to nearly shade, which makes sense because it was very overcast. The other thing I want to do is let's mask out less of our sharpening here. So I'm going to hold down Alt again and slide this over. That way we're sharpening it a good amount. Maybe we'll increase the amount of sharpening. And let's go to Effects and add just a touch of texture. So not going crazy here, obviously, but I just want there to be a bit more texture in the fur. That way it's going to help draw the eye. Nothing crazy, something like that. And then I'm going to hit OK. So now we have two very different versions of our Weddell seal here. And really all I'm trying to accomplish with this is that I want our background to be very clean and very blue, and then have our Weddell seal be very warm and draw the eye. So what we can do is let's throw a black layer mask on this layer here by holding down Alt or Option, click on New Layer Mask, boom. Black conceals, which means that our warm version of our raw file is not being shown. And now we can use this layer mask to bring in our seal. There's a bunch of different ways we could do it. Probably the easiest is if we go up here and we select the Object Selection tool, and then click and drag over the area where our object is going to make its best guess at selecting the object. And you can see that it's kind of not very well selected our seal. So that didn't work. So I'm going to do a different method. Let's right click and grab our quick selection tool, and we'll just click and drag over our seal, let go. And when we start getting close to that edge, just be careful not to go onto our background. And occasionally I let go and make sure that the marching ants are looking good here. So if I zoom in, you can see that it's not quite up to the edge. So we're just going to paint a little more. Anywhere that it's spilled over the edge, I hold down Alt or Option, and you see how it changes to a minus. Then you can refine that selection there. Once you get it close, you can also go up to the Select and Mask workspace. So this kind of brings up a little workspace that is just for refining a selection. You see how sharp this edge is here? We don't really want that. We want it to be, more refined and more feathered. So what we do is we start off with this tool here, which is the Refine Edge Brush tool. And if we want to add to the selection, we paint over it with the plus. But if we need to remove from the selection, if it's grabbed something too much, you hold down Alt and it changes to a minus. We can also go back to this quick selection tool for these areas that it's getting into the fur too much. So we'll just paint over that, and it tells Photoshop to take another look. Once we get our edge close, not perfect, but close. Let's see. We'll remove a little there. Once we get it close, the next thing you can do here is this button here. This is the Refine Hair button. And when we do that, it tells Photoshop that, hey, there's fur or hair, and you need to refine that edge better. And as soon as we do that, it should have done a much better job. Yeah, it kind of did, kind of didn't. It should do a better job at looking for hair here. So just going back and forth, refining this edge, and then we'll grab the Refine Edge brush tool, make it a little bit smaller with the bracket keys, and paint over this edge. It's a little bit of a tedious step, but it's a lot of times these tedious steps are the difference between a clumsy edit and a good edit. So you want to take a little time on this step, make sure that your selection that you're using is a good one. So we're just painting over this edge with the Refine Edge tool, making sure that nothing is selected that shouldn't be. And what will happen if you don't take the time on this step is that, especially with as dramatic as our two different color temperatures are, you're going to either end up with a cold halo in our seal or a warm halo around our seal where the two color temperatures are different. So I'm just painting over this edge, looking for areas that are not great. And it doesn't have to be 100% absolutely perfect. You just can't have those sharp edges that are not even close, because that's when you start getting into really strange looking results. As long as you take the time with this Refine Edge tool, you'll be good. Okay. So now we've got our selection. We're going to hit OK. Boom. And now we've got a selection. Great. What do we do with it? So the first thing I want to do with it is let's go ahead and save this selection just in case we need to use it again for anything, since we took the time to create it. So I'm going to go to the Channels tab and click on this button, which will save our current selection, as a channel. So when I look at this, you can see that here's our current selection that we just created. So anytime you want to refer back to this, you go here and you hold down Control Command and you click on it. And then we get our marching ants and it becomes a selection. So now with this, and I need to turn the eyeball off on this, go like this. With this, with our marching ants, with our current selection, what I'm going to do here is hide them by going Control Command H, boom, hide. So we don't have to look at it. And then on our layer mask, I'm just going to grab a paintbrush, a white paintbrush. I'm going to go 100% opacity, and I'm just going to paint in our warmer color temperature. When we first do this, it's going to be a pretty extreme change. So we need to kind of let our eyes get adjusted to it. But you see the end result where we have this nice warm color temperature seal that is its natural color. This is the color it actually was. And our colder rendition of our background that, to me, the reason I did this is it feels clean and crisp and cold. So before, after, before, after. So at this point, this is our starting point for our edit. Now we get to start editing. Honestly, like as is, I really like it. Now that my eye has gotten used to that warmer color temperature, I'm liking it. I think I want to do a little bit of dodging on the fur. So this is a technique that I call guided dodging and burning. This is kind of an advanced technique because we're going to utilize luminosity masks, but it's going to allow me to dodge and bring out highlights in the fur in a refined way. So one of the things that you can do is let's create a new dodge burn layer. So new blank layer, change the blend mode to either soft light or overlay. I'm going to go overlay this time. And let's grab a luminosity mask. So this up here is TK Actions, and you create luminosity masks with this button here. Now, when you create luminosity masks, you can base them on brightness. So right now it's just basing it off of a black and white version of our photo, but we can also base it off of color. So because we have so much blue in our scene, I can kind of use the yellow channel to isolate our seal a bit more. You see the difference between this and this? This one has less of that background selected. So what I'm looking for is a stencil. So something like this is going to serve as a pretty good stencil to keep me in the highlights of our fur. So if I make a selection of this, then we go back to our dodge burn layer, and I'm going to sample the color of this brightest fur here, and we're going to brighten it up. So let's see here. We'll find a nice warm color here. We'll brighten it up, make sure it's not too saturated. And then with a 20 or 30% opacity brush, you just start painting into the areas of the fur that we're wanting to brighten a touch. So we're wanting to draw the eye to our seal and create a little bit of depth and dimension in that fur. So you do that by leaving the shadows alone, but by brightening some of the brightest highlights. And this technique allows us to brighten highlights without just brightening everything. It leaves the shadows or the darker tones alone, and the end result is a more depth-filled three-dimensional image. So when you're doing this, it doesn't feel like you're doing a lot, but when you toggle your layer off and on, before, after, you see how we brought out a little bit of depth and dimension on our Weddell seal. And it just makes it feel more like it's got more depth and it's more interesting. It's like you can think of it as very control freak contrast, where you're going in and you're adding contrast locally only where you want it. So something like this. Another thing that I would like to do is let's just recover our highlights in that background just a bit, just in the background. which is going to bring out just a little bit more of the color in that glacier. So to do that, I'm just going to go up. Let's create another luminosity mask, but this time I want to target the blue tones, which is going to really isolate the background there. And then with this selected, let's go maybe this one, a lights 2, which is really going to ignore our seal, which is good. Let's grab a levels adjustment with that. So now I've got a contrast adjustment layer with this as its layer mask. So it's going to keep that adjustment out of the seal for the most part. And then we can add just a touch of contrast. And you see, as I do that, you see what happens to our background. So I'm just wanting to add just a touch of contrast like that, before, after, just to bring out a touch of color there. I'm going to do one more thing to this. I'm going to do the old Nick Page Orton effect. TK Actions actually has a Nick Page section here. So, because I am that fancy, here on the right side here, you see it says Nick Page. We have a Camera Raw Orton, and this is how I do my Orton effect. So what it does is, first it creates a version of our photo and it blurs it. You see, you have your radius. It depends on the pixel radius or the megapixel count of your camera. I'm going to leave this somewhere around in the 20s. Hit OK. And then it's going to take that blurred layer and open it up inside of Adobe Camera Raw. So here you can play with the brightness. You want it to be very bright, very contrasty. But we also can play with color temperature. So normally I add warmth into our highlights or into this effect. But this time I'm not. I want to keep it pretty neutral. So we're just going to bring these back down to close to 0 and then hit OK. So now we have a blurred version of our photo and a bright contrasty version of our photo. But the other thing that the Orton effect does is it only allows it to go into the highlights. So now we have those highlights beginning to glow just a little bit. And all this does is add just kind of a softness to the image. It takes away some of the crunchiness, makes it feel a little bit more atmospheric. It's a little bit more of that Nick Page special sauce. So at this point, I want to sharpen it. In this case, I'm processing this for my YouTube video, and inside of TK Actions, one of the things that it has is a web sharpening feature. So this right here, this triangle is for sharpening. It's for web sharpening. And when I put images into my YouTube videos, I usually do them at like 5,000 or 6,000 pixels on the long end. But if you were posting this like Facebook or Instagram or something like that, you might want it to be something more like 2048 pixels, which is the size that Meta stuff prefers. So I'm selecting 5,000 pixels on the long end. I'm doing 80% of the strength and 72 resolution PPI. And then I'm going to hit horizontal, so it uses this, so it'll be 5,000 pixels on the long end. So when I hit horizontal, it's going to open it up in a new file. It's going to sharpen it twice, and then it's going to mask out some of the brightest highlights in one of those sharpening layers, like this. That way, it's not allowing it to sharpen some of those brightest edges. So if we turn all the layers back on, you can see that it's added a nice amount of sharpening. And if it's too much, you can just decrease the opacity of this top layer and it'll fade out some of that sharpening. So that's my edit for this guy. It takes longer to explain this stuff than to actually do it on my own, but hopefully there's something in there that you might find useful in one of your edits. All right, hope you guys are all well, and we'll see you somewhere cool. All right, take it easy.